For this Camtasia, I'll be explaining part A, B, and C of the placement logbook. The placement logbook I have here is placement logbook 3, but 2, 3, and 4 are all the same structure regarding part A, B, and C. So I'm just going to use this one as an example and go through those 3 sections. As you can see, this is a coloured document. We do that to make it easier to navigate. You will receive a black and white copy of this document to take notes on, jot down ideas, suggestions from your trainers, and then you'll have a coloured copy that you'll take with you on placement, and you'll be provided with that closer to when you leave for placement. The first section here is the placement, the contact details for the placement providers. So if there's anything that they need to speak to us about regarding how you're going on placement, they'll call reception and they'll be put through to a nursing trainer who will be on call each day whilst placement is occurring. Any correspondence is to come through the Geelong reception phone number. After hours, they will reach me on my mobile, but otherwise all correspondence will come in through the VFA reception. Part A is a summary of the professional placement details. There'll be a short summary on which particular placement it is. As you can see here, this is the subacute and acute one. And then there'll be a summary about the professional placement guidelines, all of which each student has already signed to say that they will work in accordance with the professional placement guidelines, and you will receive a photocopy of your signed guidelines before you go out on placement. We ask that students work in accordance with the nursing standards and code of practice as listed there, and any deviation or breach of these codes will result in the student potentially being immediately removed from placement. As far as logbook requirements go, I mentioned you'll be getting a black and white one to scribble things down on, but this coloured one will be a bound one that you will take with you, and it'll be your responsibility to ensure that each shift you have the date and time of your shift recorded and you have it signed off. As stated all the way through this particular book, we have colour coding. You are required to complete the blue sections. Your clinical supervisor or facilitator or nurse buddy will complete the yellow sections, and VFA staff will fill out the pink sections. There's some placement resources there for you if you need to refer to them. As far as orientation goes, we ask that you complete the Barwon Health orientation package in advance of placement. Any placement attendance will be recorded in this book. If you do not have 100% attendance at placement, you will be required to make up any missed days. Any days that are missed due to illness needs to be a medical certificate or stat dec provided. This must be provided to VFA within 24 hours of that absence. As you can see here in table 1, if you're running late for placement, you need to ring and let them know, as they'll be expecting you. If you're going to be absent due to illness, then you need to provide advance notice of that. At least 15 minutes is cutting it fairly short, so I would expect you would let them know as soon as possible. If you miss a day due to illness, you're also required to email a copy of the sick certificate or the stat dec to reception, and we ask that you staple the original copy to the inside of your coloured bound placement logbook. As far as the clinical facilitators go, or the clinical supervisors, as they'll be sometimes called, they are your main point of contact whilst on placement. They're responsible for assessing you on your clinical skills, your clinical performance. They will assess whether you're working in accordance with the code of conduct, whether you're working within the nursing standards. They will also be keeping an eye on you for ensuring you're consistent with the uniform expectations that VFA has in our student handbook, and any deviation, they'll be informing us of this. They will also be potentially a referee for you in the future, so it's very important that you maintain a professional working relationship with them and you keep them well informed of any concerns or issues that you have whilst on placement, and they will be communicating that back to us. They will also be making a note of it in this placement logbook. If any students are not progressing as they should be with placement, they will work with VFA to develop a student success plan or a clinical learning contract, which will involve additional key goals that you need to achieve to get you where you should be at that level during placement. We ask that you complete the placement provider contact details before you go on placement. You may have two placement providers, in which case you'll drop the second one down underneath. This is the placement provider signature log. It's imperative that whilst it's blue, and normally blue things are for students to complete, we want both facilitators to complete this as well as nursing buddies. So it is a yellow section. If you could ensure that the facilitator's name, their qualification, as in are they a facilitator or are they a registered nurse, is included, because when you complete your observation checklist, if the person that's observed you is not on this particular signature log, then we will not be able to deem you as satisfactory. So they must be listed on this log. As far as the attendance go, as you can see below, the blue section is what the students complete, and the yellow section is where the facilitator verifies that the student was in attendance on that day. There's a couple of spare lines there if there's any errors, but basically there's 20 for this particular placement because there's 20 days of placement. The yellow section again is completed by the facilitator at the end of placement, and they will verify that how many days we're absent. We also receive a statement from them post-placement of any hours that students missed, went home early, came in late, that sort of thing. So we know exactly who, if there was any absences or if there was any shorter shifts that were where people went home early. In this part B, it's basically a summary of the nursing enrolled nursing standards for practice that we would expect for you at that time when you go on placement. So, for example, this is placement 3, so there not all of the standards are listed, but at placement 4 they are all listed. So by the time you come to the last placement, it's expected that you'll be working in accordance with all the enrolled nursing standards for practice. These have been listed, and the ones that we think are relevant to your progression in the course and your scope of practice are the ones that we would expect you to be able to reach. If at placements 2 or 3 you fail to reach a satisfactory at the end of placement, that must be then deemed satisfactory in the 4th and final placement. So you have got every opportunity to achieve these by the final placement. The clinical facilitators will circle whether you're satisfactory or not satisfactory and will initial underneath to verify that that is them signing that. On to the next part. So at the end of the second week in this particular placement 3, the clinical supervisor will make a comment regarding your progression at that point on the placement. For placement 2, the aged care placement, we do the same thing at the end of week 1, and then at the end of week 2 for the aged care placement, there's a summative one completed by the clinical facilitator. So in this instance, this is placement 3, so there's a week 2 and a week 4. It's the same with placement 4, as they go for 4 weeks. The clinical facilitator will write down how you performed in accordance with the standards, and if there was any that you were deemed unsatisfactory, you should make a note of why. The yellow section again is where they'll be signing off. This placement 3 learning objectives is basically a summary of what we expect you to achieve on completion of this placement. So these are the things that we want you to take into consideration when you're setting your goals for placement. There might be things that you want to practice or you think that you need more work on, and this is a really good way to start thinking about your goals and what you want to achieve. The scope of practice section here is basically a list of all the essential skills that you have undertaken and been deemed satisfactory in simulation labs. Nearly all of them are listed in placement 3, but not all. Placement 4 does have every single one. For these particular skills, whilst you've been deemed competent in the simulation lab environment, you're obviously, some of them will only be demonstrated at different time points throughout the different placements that you undertake. The next part of this section B is clinical performance record. So this is where we want you to set your learning objectives. So up here we had some ideas on what we would expect you to be achieving by the end of this placement. And just down here is where we want you to set your own goals. We want you to set SMART goals. So SMART goals we have summarised in the online session that occurs 6 weeks before placement. In this particular instance, it's session 194, where placement 3 is summarised, and there's a copy of the placement 3 logbook there. If you just scroll down, it's about setting SMART goals for your learning objectives. So there's some tips on how we want you to be thinking about what you need to achieve. There's also a summary of the Rolf reflection model that you can refer to when you're undertaking any reflections during placement in your placement logbook. So set your learning objectives, and then on completion, review them and look to see, did you actually achieve what you set out to achieve? This Part C, logbook assessment requirements, is basically a summary of the units of competency that you've completed prior to this placement, and that will therefore the performance evidence that you'll be assessed on whilst on placement. So it's basically a summation of what you've covered to date. And then the next section, the Part D section, is the performance evidence checklists that relate to these particular clusters and units of competency.